So, who was the Buddha? Probably we all have some sense of the life of the Buddha. Nonetheless, it's good to probably review the main points. So, human being named Siddhartha Gautama, born we think something like 563 BCE in India, northern India, what is now Nepal, right? He was born into a particular socioeconomic situation in that he was the son of the ruler of a small kingdom there in India. So when he's born, his parents receive this prediction. This boy is either going to grow up to be a great king or a great religious leader. The father, of course, says, well, I would rather my son become a great king and succeed me and take over the kingdom, right? So he tries to keep this boy at home by giving him everything he would ever want. So this boy leads a very luxurious life. He has everything any child would ever want. Somehow, though, he escapes the palace 4 times. He goes out, he decides he wants to see the world. We know that he sneaks out with his attendant, and he sees an old person, and he sees a sick person, and he sees a dead person, and he is upset by this suffering because he has never encountered suffering. His father has shielded him from this in order to keep him from turning to some kind of ascetic or religious practice. The 4th time he goes out, he sees a religious person. He sees a mendicant or somebody who's made religious vows, and he says, I want to do that too because I'm interested in suffering, the nature of suffering, and I want to liberate people from suffering, right? Aging, sickness, death. So we also know somewhere in the traditional stories about the Buddha's life, as a child, he's sitting watching a planting festival. This festival going on. They're planting rice, and during that, he sees a bird come and eat a worm that's been turned up in the soil. And he's upset by this because clearly there's suffering, there's death, right? He realizes that this is similar, this kind of situation is similar to what's happening with the small tribes around him that are being invaded and conquered because, of course, right, he comes from a ruling family, political family, if you will. So he sees his father dealing with this. This is what's going on around him. There are many small tribes. There is no one monumental thing called India at this point, right? There are many small tribes. And he sees this bird coming to eat this worm is just like these, one tribe comes and invades and conquers and takes over and eats the next one. He says, if I succeed my father and that becomes my life path, I'm going to inherit that conflict. I'm going to inherit that situation that doesn't feel okay to me. So instead, despite his father's best efforts, in the end, right, he becomes a religious person, leaves his palace, looks for a teacher, tries many, many kinds of practice, and we know there's a whole story around that. So, although he trains with a variety of teachers, none of those practices somehow satisfies his most basic questions, his most basic, he's still concerned about suffering. He says, so there's something about human life which has the characteristic of suffering. So he keeps leaving these teachers, right? He gets as good at each of these practices as the teacher, and the tradition says every time the teacher says, oh, please stay and teach with me, you're now as good as I am. He says, no, I have questions. And I haven't got to the answer yet, haven't got to the bottom yet. So he goes and tries something else, right? Finally, he sits down by himself under a tree, and this is the story we hear at Rohatsu every year, right? He sits down by himself and he says, I'm not getting up until I understand the nature of suffering. So under the Bodhi tree, he finally attains awakening. Now we start to call him Shakyamuni Buddha. Before there's a human being sitting there, he has this awakening experience. Now we have Buddha, right? Because Buddha is about awakening. So he understands some basic things, which we are going to be talking about. After a while, he gets up from this tree. He's had a long conversation with himself in which he says, I really would like to teach this to people, but it's too profound, it's too deep, nobody but me will ever understand. So tradition says he has visitations from heavenly beings, and he's finally convinced that, yes, he needs to get up and try to teach this. So he goes off to find 5 practitioners that he had trained with previously. They're disgusted because he got up and left at some point and said, this is not the answer, I still need to keep going. Somehow he goes back and finds them, teaches them the things that he learns. They decide, yes, he's onto something here, and these become his first Sangha members. These are his first students, right? So that's a very fast story about how do we get to 3 treasures, right? So now we have somebody who's under a tree and has experienced awakening. Now we have awakening. We have Buddha, right? We have what he experienced, what he now understood about the functioning of the universe. So we have Dharma. He's teaching this to others, right? We have Dharma. And we have at least these 5 original students. So now we have Sangha, right? Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And these, of course, are the 3 treasures. So after his awakening, of course, Shakyamuni spends the rest of his life traveling around northern India, teaching people, practicing, giving talks, sitting, doing begging practice with his Sangha, which is growing and growing and growing, until he's about 80 years old. Of course, nothing he said at the time was written down. This is not the way these things were transmitted. Nobody was taking notes. Nobody was recording what the Buddha was saying. Would have been nice, but no. Instead, these things are memorized by his students. And when we start talking about sutras, one of the things we see is the teachings are full of lists. It is constant lists. He says something, and there's a list, and then there's a verse which recaps the thing. Why? Because everything was being memorized. Right? So all the early teachings come from simply being memorized and repeated. So it was a long time, a good 100 years or more, before these things were written down. However, of course, that's the origin of what we now call the Pali Canon. Pali Canon is 3 baskets of teachings, right? So we have three Pitakas, or 3 baskets. We have the Vinaya, which is the discipline. So this is rules, discipline of the Sangha. We've been talking about the Vinaya here a lot lately because we're talking about Nyoho and Nyoho-e, right? So the rules for how we make things, how we do things, conduct ourselves. There's the Sutta Pitaka, or Sutta or Sutra, which is the discourses, the sermons, the teachings of the Buddha. There's some poetry in there. It is the largest basket. So as Gene says, there are millions and millions and millions of words. The third one is the Abhidharma. So these are things that elaborate Buddhist doctrines, commentaries, particularly about the mind, or we might say about psychology, but we have to be a bit careful about that. It's the sort of systematic philosophy, right? So it's a little bit obscure, a little bit abstract. Okay, so now we also have the context for the Sanbuki, the 3 Buddha days. Those are 3 observances that we practice here will remember, right? So we have Buddha's birthday in April. We have his awakening in December, Rohatsu, and we have the Nirvana day when his physical body dies, right? So these 3 Buddha days are important days in our calendar. And you might remember we've just now produced a new booklet through Dogen Institute with Toda-san's teachings about these 3 Buddha days. So we see we now have Buddha, Dharma, Sangha. We've got the 3 Buddha days. We start to see how things are being established around Buddha's life, right?